Hello and welcome to the Bitcoin Butlers podcast. I am Mike Watkins, and with me, as always, is my good friend and business partner, Matt Burke.
Hello.
And each episode, we try and bring you an intellectually honest discussion about news and events affecting Bitcoin. If you like our content, please like, subscribe, and share. So, the past couple of weeks have been kind of a slow news cycle in the world of Bitcoin.
Mhm.
However, Matt, you and I were lucky enough to go to a fireside chat put on by the Atlanta Bit Devs. And at that chat, they had Hester Pierce, who is one of the 5 commissioners for the SEC.
That's right.
And I thought we heard a number of interesting things that evening. What's one of the things that you thought was particularly interesting or that struck you?
Well, I think maybe what struck me the most, first of all, I thought that Hester Pierce was a very thoughtful and knowledgeable person. She made it pretty clear that she's maybe the only of the 5 commissioners that spends their time studying Bitcoin and crypto. And I thought that she was really knowledgeable and helpful in helping kind of to understand the process that the SEC is going through with relation to these assets. The other main takeaway that I had is that in general, the SEC is using a sledgehammer where they should be using a scalpel. They are taking a very broad stroke approach, and they kind of view all of these assets in a bucket with a little bit of differentiation, but for the most part, they're approaching them as if they're all the same. And it struck me that there isn't, at least at this point, a clear consensus within the SEC whatsoever that, Bitcoin is different than the other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, I would say that was one of the more disappointing things that we heard, but I also thought her explanation made a lot of sense, which was that they're they really don't know much about this. And to them, they don't really care about the nuance that Bitcoin is a certain thing and all these other things are, let's call them replicas or imposters, whatever word you want to use. But that it was all just lumped into the crypto bucket. And we know because we see this in our personal lives. People will lump Bitcoin in with crypto. And Matt, I know I've been around you countless times where you said Bitcoin, not crypto.
Right.
But to these regulators and these government officials, they aren't going to spend the time to study it, to listen to the podcast, to read books, to really get into the nuance of why Bitcoin is one of the greatest inventions in the history of man and why 99.9% of the altcoins are garbage.
Yeah, I think that she made it really clear that they're not getting anywhere close to that level of nuance, really to any level of nuance. And almost that, I would say this is consistent with most government, is that they kind of take a lazy approach to it, in the sense that I feel like in many situations they would rather the problem come to them than for them to try to solve the problem in advance. So they want to be able to say, okay, this person did something bad. Now we can use that as a way to create a framework to regulate it, as opposed to saying, we understand these things. Here's how we think they should be regulated.
Would you say that's more of a reactive approach, like something breaks and then the solution is to, okay, well, something's broken. We can come in with our big hammer, solve it very quickly. And no one's going to complain that we used a sledgehammer where we should have been using a scalpel.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's certainly some of that. It makes them have to do less work. But at the same time, she also made it clear that there are some very sophisticated people working on various areas of the cryptocurrency space, and that there are people who understand it, and that they are taking a hard look at it. But I got the sense that maybe that was from more of an enforcement perspective, meaning that they have the ability to know when somebody has clearly violated a securities regulation,
Mhm.
and that's what they'll use to enforce violations of those regulations. But I just didn't get the sense that there's really any cohesive approach to how they're going to deal with these things.
I would agree, and this may sound a bit cynical, but judging by what she said, you really got a bit of visibility into the I'm gonna say the politics of how this stuff works, and also the incompetence of the people involved. Meaning they're not trying to solve problems. They're not trying to really make something great. So we'll use something like AI and ChatGPT that has uh, been quite impactful in the world over the past month or two,
Hmm.
right? And I guarantee you that, well, I know Google's scrambling because they've got something coming out, but I guarantee you, and Microsoft's invested in ChatGPT, but I
Hmm.
guarantee you that all over Silicon Valley and all these tech companies and anyone involved in tech is now having meetings, maybe some panic meetings on what are we going to do? How do we incorporate this? How do we use this to our advantage? How do we protect ourselves from what may come from this? They're really looking out into the future. This is a guess. I can't say for sure, but I know it's
Hmm.
definitely happening in some places because that's the way that private business works a lot of time, which is that people involved in private business are trying to figure out where things are going, where they're going to be, and they want to position themselves to be in the correct spot later. Whereas when you deal with government, and then I got this from Hester Pierce, is that they just don't really want to step out of line too much. That like that's more of a concern. Like I just don't want to get too far out of line with this.
Hmm.
As well as the different governmental agencies all jockeying for position for who gets to have more
Yeah.
power and control,
Oh, and that was
right?
a really interesting part of it as well, which is that there are so many regulatory bodies that could, in theory, have a say in what goes on in the space.
Mhm,
The SEC is just one of several.
mhm,
On top of that, you've got the Fed, you've got the CFTC, you've got FinSec, you've got OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. All of these various governmental agencies that you know all want to be uh, law enforcement heroes, for lack of a better
mhm,
term. I mean, these are
mhm,
executive agencies,
mhm.
and they they want to all have their say in how this stuff gets regulated.
Right, and with that, who knows what direction it's really going to go in, but part of what I heard, I thought was pretty encouraging in that it sounded like they just didn't know what to do. And one of the things she described was that they were used to working in a system that was essentially 100 plus years old.
Hmm.
They knew the players in the system, they knew how the system worked. They were really familiar with it. And they were, I'll use the term, experienced in dealing with it, maybe even skilled in dealing with it. But now something new came along and they don't know what to do with it because
Yeah,
there's no one before them has created a path, has solved this for them. So they're in this really weird spot where one, they've never really had to do anything new before,
right.
right? The people work, it's just all been the same, whether you have technology that's helping in the delivery of things, but they've never had a new asset to deal with. And I got the feeling from her that they were a bit like deer in headlights with it.
Absolutely. It's such and look, it's less than 100-year-old institution. It hasn't been
Mhm,
around that long.
mhm,
um and when the SEC was formed, it really came out of the Great Depression, and
mhm,
where you had enormous financial collapse, and this was the agency that was put in place to help protect retail
mhm,
investors from
mhm,
from being taken advantage of. And it's really focused on that aspect of it for almost 100 years. And so it makes sense that you could say that this is just everything they've done has always been based on these traditional assets and working within the existing system. And so when you have something like Bitcoin and crypto that kind of turns a lot of those traditional assets on their head, it makes sense that they wouldn't know what to do with it.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it also, it begs the question, like, the one thing I was thinking about when she was talking about this, she talked a little bit about the spot ETFs and grayscale, and her position is that she doesn't see why there shouldn't be a spot ETF. And what I was thinking about when she was talking about this is that she made the comment that they're just not really sure, how to treat it and how to come in and regulate it as a, to that there's nobody regulating the Bitcoin spot market. Well, if you take a gold ETF and you look at how that's being regulated, why couldn't you just use that as a model or a starting point to figure out how to do it with Bitcoin? It's,
Mm.
there, you have precious metal ETFs, you have, commodity index ETFs.
Mhm.
It seems like it would be a natural progression to start with that as your framework. But it seems like they're, maybe even too paralyzed to do that.
That's if they are trying to, and that's also
True.
if they are, really trying to focus on Bitcoin, or if they're really trying to focus on the rest of the crypto. And I got a feeling from her, and I don't know if you agree or disagree, that a lot of their attention is on crypto, not on Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think I would go even a step further and say that I think their focus may be more on um, exchanges and
Mhm.
on certain crypto projects that are clearly unregistered securities. I got the sense that
Mm.
that's probably what they're looking towards the most. But I think, from a political standpoint, it also makes sense that they would be looking at exchanges, in the wake of FTX and and trying to step in and say, okay, if you're going to run an exchange, then we're going to have a say in what's going on there.
Well, that would make sense if you think about what the SEC does in the,
Sure.
the world of finance right now. That's sort of what their wheelhouse is,
Right. By
right?
definition, that's
Mhm.
kind of what they're the Security Exchange Commission. So if you're
Right.
exchanging securities and
Right,
you
right.
can deem that crypto assets are in fact securities, then it would follow that that's who would regulate it.
Mhm. But, once again, so do you think a lot of their focus is on, not necessarily the mechanics of an exchange, but in the marketplace of digital assets, that their attention is more on, the crypto space? Because she mentioned DeFi to us, that was a particularly big area of interest to her,
Mhm.
and I'll be transparent here, DeFi is of very little interest to me personally.
Yeah.
It's not a
Um,
thing against DeFi, it's just that I don't have much, it's not particularly exciting to me.
well, what I would say is that based on the way that she framed it, it sounds like she's kind of the lone wolf in the group.
Mhm, for sure.
So even if she is really focused on DeFi, there's a good chance that her colleagues on the commission have no idea what DeFi is. Not, that's generalizing, but
Mhm,
that, they haven't gone far enough down the path to even understand the difference between a DeFi protocol and Bitcoin and and some other Ethereum based token or
mhm.
whatever. It's, so um, there's a definite lack of knowledge on the commission. That doesn't mean there's the same lack of knowledge on the staff who's spending their day, studying this stuff. But ultimately, the commission is the one that causes things to happen.
Right, right. And I also think in the world of what they'd be regulating, are they really concerned about something like a Coinbase where people can go and they can buy Bitcoin using funds from their bank account? And there's no staking going on or anything like that. People just buying, let's just call it a version of digital gold, just to
Hmm.
make it easy. And there's really nothing where consumers are being hurt by that, assuming that the exchange doesn't steal money from you, and the exchange sells you the real Bitcoin, right? And the exchange
Right.
lets you pull that Bitcoin off the exchange and store it privately. The consumer is not being hurt in any way there. They're just enabling, making sure that the consumer can find a trustworthy exchange to use and that the exchange follows all the rules. And so
Sure.
with that, it's beneficial to the consumer.
Yep. And in the case of Coinbase, it goes a step further, which is, they're a public company and they've got to report on what they're doing, and they have to have audits done and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't really see that as what they're targeting so much as really the things that that are allowing consumers to make decisions that that reasonable people shouldn't make, in terms of put $100 in and we'll pay you 30% interest on it, no questions asked. And that's the type of thing that I think they're gonna take exception with.
I agree. I'll say that on a more general level with what was talked about, I just got the sense that they were lost.
Mhm.
Now we know Gary Gensler knows Bitcoin. He knows what Bitcoin is. I've watched his course, so
Yeah.
he knows what Bitcoin is. So, but he's very much a political animal. I think they're all political animals, right? They're all appointed for 5 years, and they're all independent.
And they're partisan. So
for sure.
And the commission set up that way on purpose. There is a balance of partisanship on the commission, but yeah, they're definitely politically driven, for sure.
I thought that was one of the interesting things that I had no clue about before that chat, which was that there can be no more of the 5 people on the SEC commission. There can be no more than 3 of the party in power.
The President's Party.
President's Party, right? Yeah. President's Party, exactly.
Right. So right now, yeah, right. And I believe Hester Pierce was a Republican appointee by Trump.
She was. That's what she said. Mm-hmm.
Although she's going for another 5-year commission, even though she's still a Republican appointee.
What do you mean she's going for another 5-year commission?
So I think her term is up in like 2025.
2025, right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. She's had more than one 5-year term. It's like 5 years term plus a 3-year term or something.
Right. Like she replaced somebody.
Right.
So she didn't get her full 5 years. So she's had extra time there, is what she was saying.
Right. But my point being that she's made it through administrations of multiple parties and, continues to serve. And so I thought she was very, very knowledgeable and thoughtful, and political. She stopped short of answering several questions that I think, could have been more politically biased if she had gone down the path, but she kept it in check. It was good.
Mm-hmm. I was impressed and pleased with what I saw. I think we need more like her.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. And her knowledge of the material was to be commended.
Oh yeah.
Right. Like, I don't think the other 4 members of the SEC, well, Gary Gensler knows, but I don't think the other 3 members of the SEC commission have anywhere near the knowledge of her. And I was also surprised by her what seemed like her genuine passion for it, like the podcast that she listens to, that she's just genuinely curious about the material. But I also got the sense that she's not a Bitcoiner.
No. Yeah, I actually, after we left, I was like, oh, I should have asked her if she owned Bitcoin.
That would have been a good question. Anything else on this that you can think of?
Not really. I mean, I think it was a treat to get to hear somebody at that level talk about what's going on, even though, I would say we didn't get a ton of concrete answers on where things are headed, but I don't know that she knows or anyone else at this point knows.
I don't think there are concrete answers on where it's headed. The thing that I got most was that they don't know what to do. And the other thing that I thought was interesting, she said that not just them, but the people in Congress have so many issues on their plate that
Hmm.
they're not. We may be thinking about this. This may be an area of interest to us. We may be spending time each week pondering things and keeping up with news and trying to figure out where things are going and thinking about how each thing affects Bitcoin adoption, et cetera. But she reiterated a few times that they've got so much on their plate that they're not thinking about it till
Right.
something comes up.
It's not a priority.
Definitely not a priority. Definitely not. And that's an interesting thing I'd like to bring up as far as the priority. This is a discussion that you and I had, I think, a couple weeks ago, not on a podcast though, that in some ways you could view Bitcoin as being this game that was released on the world. And the game was going to be Bitcoin against, I don't know, who do you want to put as the other party in the world? I'll call it the, help me out here, Matt. Who's the other player in this game?
Central banks.
Central banks. Thank you. Yeah, that is the right player, actually. So the idea is that once this game is released on the world, that you only have a certain amount of time to kill it before the incentives of the game make, I'm just going to use Bitcoin, make Bitcoin too strong. So one of the incentives we've seen is the decentralization of mining, where
Hmm.
we've got, it must be millions. I don't know the exact number. There's got to be millions of individual computers, essentially decentralized, that are all supporting this network and making it the most powerful monetary network in the world, the most powerful computer network in the world, the most secure computer network in the world. And I think I may be missing one. But the point is that
Reliable uptime.
reliable too, uptime for sure. That's crazy how reliable it is. But the point is that in some ways it may be too late. And in other ways, never underestimate the power of government and how they can do it, what they can do. You won't stop it necessarily, but when I use that and I overlay that idea of that very, very complicated game, which is a lot of game theory and incentives in it, it's
Hmm.
really, it's one of those things that initially looks very simple, but it's one of those, I know that you know that I know that you know that I know
Right.
that you know. It sort of goes forever, almost like looking into multiple mirrors where it just kind of goes forever. And I wonder if these politicians and regulators really have the tools to take, really have the tools and knowledge to be strong players in this game, if that's even possible, because I don't know. I'm not saying that we should never have the hubris that governments can't do anything about Bitcoin. What they can do is stop you from interacting with it
Right. That's really what I think is the risk. But the other thing to what you were saying is that the pace at
to some
which the
degree.
yeah, yeah, but the pace at which these things move through government um, is honestly no match for Bitcoin. And
Correct.
and so the way that I think about that is you might have a group of people, and let's just be optimistic or pessimistic, maybe depending on how you look at it. But let's just assume that tomorrow Congress woke up and decided that they were going to come up with a um, logical and reasonable regulatory framework for Bitcoin and say other crypto, whatever. That they decided, despite what Hester Pierce says, this is now their top priority, and let's get something done. Well, okay, when does something actually get done? And what happens to Bitcoin between now and the time that that gets done? And what
Mhm.
happens other than a block getting laid down every 10 minutes, which is going to continue to happen no matter what, with, thousands of transactions in each of those blocks. Um, Aside from that, you've got um, increased investment into Bitcoin related businesses. You've got development of applications around Bitcoin. You've got just overall adoption happening. You know, and so to your point about the game, even if the other side of the game were to decide that they wanted to become strong players, by the time they were able to implement that, um, Bitcoin's going to be even further down the road than it is
Mhm.
right now. So it's
Mhm.
it gets very hard to catch at that point.
Well, I think that the government's been playing a cat and mouse game in a lot of industries. I mean, the illegal drug trade, for example, they haven't been able to stop illegal drugs. Maybe in Singapore, but the U.S.
Right.
government's never been able to stop illegal drugs ever. And we have a war on drugs been going on for 50 something years. So they've been
Hmm.
actively saying this is 100% illegal. You, they have these crazy laws that if three strikes and you go to prison is it for life or 25 years, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So just because you make something illegal doesn't mean it's going to stop. Killing people is illegal.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
S-
yeah.
so, but I think what the point I was trying to make is when I overlay that concept on top of what we heard, as far as the the inner workings that we were exposed to, understanding that was a very minimal amount of the inner workings for the SEC, but it's still the best window that I think you and I have had into that process.
Hmm.
Certainly was for me. You realize that it's uh, it's a very interesting dynamic because you've got these people that really don't know how to deal with it, don't really know what it is, aren't forward thinkers, are much prefer paths to be laid for them and just to follow the same guide that was there before, up against this very unique thing that can't be stopped, that has this game theory and very powerful incentive structure built in. And it will be interesting, I think, when we finally have this showdown, if there is ever a showdown, because Bitcoin, in a lot of ways, is an unstoppable force. So, what's that adage? Like, what happens when unstoppable
An
force
immovable.
means
Yeah.
immovable object?
Yeah.
So, we may see that. I don't know. I hope we don't. I hope that they are much smarter about this, but I don't have a ton of optimism for that.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think that um, again, there's not a
There's
whole lot that you can do. The decentralized nature of this thing makes it very, very difficult to kill,
mhm,
um, almost impossible in my view.
mhm.
But like you said, it doesn't have to be killed to be crippled. It could be it could become to where it's very difficult to get into or out of those assets. But maybe one of the upsides of that is that if the ability for it to interact with the existing monetary system goes down, the in my view, I would see the value and the ability to now use it as a medium of exchange would go up tremendously, because if you have less of an ability to convert Bitcoin to dollars, for example, then you have more of an incentive to use your Bitcoin as your primary currency.
I think that's really smart, really smart, and I agree. That's it's the problem is that when you ban it, right, the price goes up, and then this is anything, whatever you ban, the
Sure.
price goes up, right? That's not Bitcoin. That's just everything. But considering the fact that Bitcoin has baked into it, it's a Venmo, right?
Right.
It's a Zelle. It actually functions. It actually works. And it can work for you to send anything from you to anyone anywhere on the planet in that's essentially instant, right? It's just there's no barriers for you to send money to someone in Nigeria or Portugal or England or Australia.
Yeah.
It's
Over
kind of all this.
Lightning, over Lightning, you can call it instant on chain. It's
Right,
not
right,
instant, but it's still faster than sending a wire.
right. But Lightning's a real thing, right? Lightning has what, over
Absolutely.
5,000 Bitcoins on it now. So, so the thing is that you may be in a situation where when you need to call a plumber out to your house, it's $500 for the plumber, or it's X number of Satoshis. And if we're just going to call it $500 if you pay cash and $400 if you pay in Bitcoin, because it's so hard to get.
Right.
And people have been doing this. Actually, this is actually happening in Nigeria. The price they're paying in Nigeria is what, like double what we're paying
Yeah, I
here?
think it's about
Right.
double. It's at least double because they're doing it all peer to peer, and that's what they're using. So the value of it goes up.
Right. So that's the downside. That's the problem with using that sledgehammer, is that there are consequences. You're also going to open up opportunities for other countries to take the lead, because if you think you're going to kill it, you're not. Right. And, there's a lot of geopolitical craziness going on in the world right now. We are seeing this bifurcation with the BRICS
Sure.
countries, something we've talked about on this podcast. And so I'm just throwing this. I don't think this would happen, but you can't say it would never happen, that all of a sudden the US bans Bitcoin and crypto. They do this. They just choke off your ability to get for the on-ramps and off-ramps. Okay. Well, maybe the BRICS countries adopt it and become the leader in that. Maybe Africa becomes a leader in that, but more like, the BRICS would be a bigger threat to the US. Right. If China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, India's in that. Also, it's a lot. It's a pretty big chunk of the world's population. And then you may get a bunch of the Middle East countries in that. You may get the African countries in that. And all of a sudden, the US goes from the dollar being the world reserve asset to being, I don't want to say somewhat isolated, but I'm going to say somewhat isolated.
Or more isolated than it is
More
now.
isolated. So it's not one, this idea that if we crush it and we choke it off, that we win, we being US government, right? You don't know, because it's that weird incentive structure. And it's completely open. So
yeah,
I think that is, and one thing I do want to bring up, Hester Pierce did say that there are people at the SEC whose sole job it was to study Bitcoin and crypto.
Yes.
Right. That's all they do all day, basically. Wouldn't mind that job. And so I will say this. I thought she was a very intelligent and thoughtful person.
Yeah.
Undeniably intelligent and thoughtful. I'm just going to leave it at that. And she had the ability to think through some things. She was actually thinking through some things with the altcoins I thought was pretty smart. I don't think we need to get into that, but the point is she's thought through this on numerous levels, and there is that weird game theory built in, which is great. If we kill it, what does someone else do? And then do we have to come back in later? And where are we in that position if we have to come back in as like a second tier player? You think the US wants to be a second tier player in the world of digital assets?
In the world of anything.
In the world of anything, right. But particularly in the world of money.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's going to play out. And one last thing I'd like to add, I think, before we end this spot, was that she said that she thought it was quite sad that the people involved in the space were constantly talking about regulation. That they weren't talking about innovation, but had a bigger focus on regulation. And I thought that was pretty insightful too.
Yeah, that was insightful. I think that's the point there is that if it wasn't something that all of these builders had to worry about, what more could they be building? And, we would be light years ahead of where we are now, which, you look at the state of Bitcoin and everything built around it, look at it now compared to 10 years ago. And, it's crazy, but imagine if there was regulatory clarity in place that would allow people to be able to focus on innovation without having to worry about whether or not whatever they're building might not be allowed to be built at some point.
Yeah, and to add to what you said there, if we take everything in Bitcoin in like 4-year cycles,
Hmm.
where were we in 2019? And in my opinion, we're sort of light years. It may be 4 years in calendar time, but we're kind of light years away in terms of the industry.
Sure. And in terms of adoption, and in terms of
Mhm.
new things that have happened, both on
Lightning
the
Network?
Lightning Network, the way that mining has played out, um, some of the energy components to
Sure,
mining
sure.
that, I don't think 4 or 8 years ago anybody was really considering, how you might use Bitcoin mining to stabilize the electricity grid. Not that nobody had thought of it, but it wasn't really in the forefront of the conversation in any
Right.
way. So all of these ideas that, just show you how creative humans can be when they have something new to work with. It's
Mhm.
pretty, I think it's astounding what's been accomplished in a short time.
Right, and I think you and I both have more homework to do on Noster,
Hmm.
but, I do know that their social media app was in the App Store. And so, not just in the Bitcoin realm and not just with Lightning, but where are some of these other second and third layer projects, particularly Nostr, in 4 years from now?
Yeah.
Right? How robust are those? What's going on with the Lightning Network? It's almost difficult, I think, to look ahead 4 years in this industry because where a lot of things don't really change that fast, this changes very fast. And if we want to contrast that with something like, let's just say, I'll let you pick anything from the FANG stocks, Apple, Google, whatever. Let's just take Apple. So 4 years ago is 2019. I wonder, I bet there's 20% of the people in the US walking around with an iPhone from 2019. Not that they bought it in 2019, but that
Hmm.
model they have came out in 2019, right? 2019 technology.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, is your iPhone really different from what it was 4 years ago?
Not really.
Camera's better, it's faster, has more
I mean, not since the
storage.
home button went away, pretty
Right,
much.
right, right. Face ID.
Yeah.
So, but if we and Google, is Google really any different than it was 4 years ago? We have Chat AI now, but that's not
Yeah.
really part of those companies, and that's a monumental shift that I can't quite get my head around because who can?
Yeah. It's crazy.
Um, but I'm saying that like Microsoft's offerings are the same. Facebook is probably identical, except now they have Reels that they didn't have
Right.
before, right? A vertical video that's for a shorter amount of time to try and compete with TikTok. That's their big innovation. So, we look at the innovation in this space and it's hard to keep up with. And I know that actually Bitcoin conference in Miami is, I think, 97 days away, something,
Hmm.
something silly like that. But it's going to be here before you know it. And I know that every year when we go there, one of our objectives is to visit the vendors and try and keep up with the innovation to see what people are building, the things
Yeah.
that you don't see online. And I don't know what we're going to see this year, but I know there are going to be some things there that, are pretty surprising. That the innovation there, you do see quite a bit. And I'm looking forward to that for
Yeah,
sure.
for sure.
All right. You want to move on?
Yeah.
All right, so the next subject is something that I personally know very little about. I'm just starting to dig into it a bit, and that is the ordinals. And there's been a bit of controversy with this. So Matt, if you don't mind, get us started with what you know about the ordinals so
Yeah.
far.
And I'm also going to qualify this, which is that conceptually, I understand it. I don't understand it technically really at all. But I think the best way to describe it is that it's ordinals and inscriptions, which are they kind of go together. And ordinal is like, the difference between an ordinal number and a cardinal number is that, like, an ordinal is how you rank something numerically. So, something's first, second, third is ordinal. Whereas if you're counting, you have, you have three rocks in your hand. That's cardinal. The third rock would be ordinal. So as it relates to Bitcoin, there's this concept that you can, in theory, memorialize every Satoshi in some hierarchy. Going back to the very first Satoshi that ever entered a block, when a block reward is achieved, uh, th- that number of Satoshis goes into that transaction. There is no input. That's the only Bitcoin transaction that doesn't have an input, is the block reward. So the idea with ordinals is that there is some hierarchical way to figure out the ranking of a certain Satoshi down to, there's 2.1 quadrillion Satoshis that will ever exist. And you could number each one of those and pinpoint it to a point in time. So it gives you the ability to like memorialize a certain thing based on where that Satoshi sits in the order of time. So, an example I saw was like, you could say, okay, well, I sold my house on this date and I wanted to memorialize it. I can use that point in time in the blockchain to memorialize it. That's the ordinal. And then the other piece is that it has caused some controversy is the concept of inscriptions, which is the ability to put data into otherwise unused block space. So if you go back to the block size wars of 2017, before when SegWit was implemented, it allowed you to separate the kind of the transaction data from the what they call the witness, which is like the part that doesn't have to do with the transaction, the signature or whatever. So there's data, there's space within that witness that allows you to fill it up to the size limit of the block. And what that has allowed people to do is to put various forms of data, whether that's a JPEG or some other you could put a script in there that you could extract and run. You could actually write software into that space if you use a little enough space. So essentially, it gives you the ability to almost like create an NFT on the blockchain. Is the easiest way to. It's the easiest analogy. You could put a JPEG into a block and utilize existing space to do that. So where it's become controversial is that by doing this, you're using up space within a block that might otherwise be available for monetary transactions. So there's kind of one school of thought that says this is not a preferred use of the blockchain. People shouldn't be doing this. Or of the Bitcoin blockchain specifically, that people shouldn't be doing this because it's not, Bitcoin is a monetary network and this is not monetary in nature. And it's not helpful to the overall size of the blocks, and people running nodes are going to run out of disk space faster, and it's just a waste of time. And the other school of thought is that, well, the software allows you to do it. The space is there to do it. You have to pay a fee to do it because in order to get a transaction into a block, you have to pay a fee. And, depending on what miners want to pick up those transactions, you have to set the fee high enough to where it'll end up in a block. So, the argument being that if you want to put a piece of data into a transaction and a miner is willing to include that transaction within that block, then that's a free market activity, and people should be allowed to do that because that's what the code says you can do. So those are kind of the two schools of thought there.
Okay, so I have a few questions.
Okay, that I may or may not be able to answer.
Let's see where it goes. I'm just curious. So you mentioned that you're only allowed to use the leftover space in the block. Is that correct?
Well, it's the ability to use available space in the block. Now, what I don't know technically is if if that would only end up in the, you've got like this, I guess it's a 4 megabyte block size maximum. I think it's like something like that.
That's with SegWit. I think
right.
I think we'd, for this discussion, we probably should think about it more around 2 megabytes. But even if we go to 4, I wanted to actually think about it both on 2 and 4 for this. Uh,
Um, but to answer your question, I don't know exactly where in the transaction that data sits. If it can sit in the transaction data section of the block or the witness section of the block or both. I don't know.
mhm.
I don't know if it's
But
any free space. And I think it actually may be any free space because if I recall, and again, somebody more technical than me might correct me, but I
mhm,
believe that it's really that you reserve a certain amount of space in the block for the transaction data and then the rest
mhm.
of it is free. So it kind of doesn't matter. Like you get, whatever is not used for a transaction is still available for other things. So I think to the extent, because you could, in theory, you could take, you could send one Satoshi and attach a file to it or a script where you're not really sending much value in the process or any value in the process, but you're still sending that data. So I don't think it really matters if it's which section of the block it's in per se.
But what I'm trying to understand is it is the use of these ordinals bumping out transactions? Or is it saying, okay, here are the transactions that we have. There's of the, I'll just say, there's 225K left in this block. And so someone can put in a JPEG
Well,
or a file.
I don't think it's that. I think what it is, the controversy around it is that it's going to make blocks bigger
Hmm.
and it's going to make fees higher.
Hmm. No,
Um,
I
and
get
so that
that.
and so it's not that yeah, it's the the issue is that if your average block size right now is about 2 megabytes,
Mm,
and here I'll pull up mempool. The last several blocks I'm looking at are between 1.4 and 2.3 megabytes, and so if you have the ability to use up to 4 megabytes, if your
mm.
average is two, um, but now you start making it to where the average is closer to four, then you could theoretically double the size of the blockchain. Um,
Okay. And so is that really a big deal with the way that storage is increasing?
it's not, and I've seen some math done on this. Is that even if you went to 4 megabytes for every single block, it would still be. I think it would still be decades before you needed to get more than a 1 terabyte hard drive or something
Right,
like that. Like
right.
it's, I don't, those aren't the exact numbers,
Sure.
but it's when you map out the, 10 minutes per block and the size of the block and how much actual space that is,
Mhm.
it's, it's not in any way threatening to
Right.
the size of the blockchain.
Not at all, which is one of the geniuses about that small block size that you
Mhm.
couldn't expand it. And then the other thing I'm thinking about this is, well, what do you want to put in there? And why would you want to put it there? Because you're how big do you think the biggest file that someone could use for something like this would be? Well, I mean, the block size is only 4 megabytes
Right. So, I mean,
or 2 megabytes or
it's
something.
3 point something megabytes.
Right. So, but I'm saying like a part of that's going to be used with transactions. That doesn't leave you a ton of room. So if you want to store like a 250K text file,
Right.
I
It's
guess you can. I mean, I don't know why. I don't know why you want to pay fees to do that because they're going to charge you to do that. And maybe it's a vanity project or something. I don't,
Well,
you
I
never
think
know.
that's what it comes down to is that a lot of this is just, it's gimmicky in a way. It's something that can be done. And I think that a lot of people are worked up about it because they think it's a poor use of Bitcoin. Um, but at the same time, you know, let the free market decide.
Ugh,
Ultimately,
these,
if everybody wants to pay high fees to have their text file encoded in a Bitcoin transaction, then let them pay those inflated fees to do that. And
right.
and I think realistically, over time, there's not going to be, there are better ways to do that than to do it, using Bitcoin, in my opinion.
That's same thought I have is that, okay, maybe it's kind of a gimmicky thing right now. It does really have a really, what's the long-term market for this? And it's minimal at best because you can't store very much.
Yeah.
You can't
And look there.
store I think a picture from your iPhone is about 3 MB.
Yeah, I was going to say most pictures on a cell phone are probably, pushing up against that. You couldn't put
Hmm.
a normal, high def picture into a block without using up most of the block. So yeah, I think that there's not, from that standpoint, there's not much practicality to it. And you could view it. And if you look at, a lot of these uh, NFTs that went for a lot of money, a couple of years ago, um, they're not high definition graphics or anything like that. They're just, rudimentary JPEGs for the most part. So if that's
Hmm.
what you want to put in the blockchain, I think a lot of people will find that to be silly. Some people might have an affinity for it for whatever reason, but I'm not personally that concerned about it long term. I don't think it's a good use long term, and I think the market will shake that out.
How do people make money on it? Like if it's going to be there, it's going to be difficult to survive if there isn't some kind of uh, way that people are going to make money on it.
Yeah. You mean the people that are generating this content that they're encoding in transactions?
Right. I mean, we have Valentine's Day coming up. Maybe you want to say, you love your girlfriend or wife on there, right? And that takes 10K or something like that. She gets like what, a certificate? How much she
Yeah, I
get
don't
that
know. You
that
get a
tells you that you put on the chain, and then what can you
you
do
get
with
a
it?
you get a Bitcoin address, and you copy
But
that
right. Yeah,
into
she
your
would love that.
mempool, and
Yeah, it's gonna be hot on
yeah,
Valentine's Day. So
QR code.
so I just don't know to what end this has any kind of real viability long term. And maybe it'll be some niche thing that some, like
Well, look, if
techie
somebody
programmers want to do.
if
But
somebody tuned in and heard the last 30 seconds of that, you could be talking about any NFT.
right.
Right. It's not the fact. The only difference here is that it's sitting on the Bitcoin blockchain and potentially taking up, space. Um, so, I think all of those types of things end up in the same place, which is that either people value them or they don't. And the result, is reflective of that.
Yeah. I think I was going to do a deeper dive into this and thinking it through in real time right here. I'm just going to be a little patient. I don't think it needs attention right now. If this starts to become a thing, then I think you can devote some valuable and scarce time towards it. But as of right now,
It's a nothing burger.
it seems like a nothing burger. Yeah, for sure.
That's how I see it. I mean, I think it is an interesting, study on unintended consequences, though,
Hmm.
because the ability to do this, and again, this is getting more technical than I am, but I believe that the implementation of Taproot and some of the Merkle trees and those aspects of Bitcoin that changed with Taproot, help to facilitate the ability to do this, or to do it more easily. And so I think a lot of people are saying, well, there's no reason within the code that this can't be done, but it certainly wasn't something that was contemplated when they implemented Taproot.
Right. And I like I said, as of right now, I'm going to just relax on this a bit. I, 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 I don't see much long term threat here to the Bitcoin blockchain by people trying to take up some of the unused block space, even if they bump the size of the average block up by 50%.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you.
It's amazing how tiny blocks are. Isn't that incredible? That
Mhm.
in 2023, a Bitcoin block is essentially 2 MB.
Yeah. Um, and I mean, that's, we can we can talk a little bit about why that's so important, because what that does is that gives anybody the ability to have their own copy of the entire blockchain
Mhm.
sitting on a 1 terabyte hard drive, without having to worry about it running out of space anytime soon.
Mm.
And, and for those of you who are, new to Bitcoin, who aren't running your own node, you absolutely should be doing that. And the reason that it's so easy to do that is because, um, the size is something that you can do with very limited amount of storage.
You want to hear something crazy?
Yeah.
I had to just look this up. So I had to just buy a new external hard drive for just some extra storage. My old one is starting to tell me that it's having some issues. And so I bought a new 5 terabyte external hard drive.
Mm-hmm.
Bought on Amazon. I don't even know what brand it is, one of the major brands. It was, frequently purchased one. I didn't put a lot of time and effort into it, but it was $90. And
Unbelievable.
that's 5 terabytes. And so then I also looked up
SSD.
No.
Okay.
No. It's a platter drive.
Yeah.
But the point is that you can buy 5 terabytes for $90. A little portable USB drive. And then I just looked up, you can buy a 1 terabyte micro SD card on Amazon for $160, $159. A 1 terabyte micro SD card for $159. It's really amazing. So when we
crazy.
talk about the block size of Bitcoin, and we think about how long it will take for the size to really become a problem, it is a 5 terabyte micro SD card, let's say a 3 terabyte micro SD card, $159 5 years from today.
No.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's possible we're going to see that, right? The micro SD cards are still just going to get bigger and bigger.
Oh yeah.
And for people who don't know what a micro SD is, it's a tiny, tiny little card that you put in some phones and some little video cameras and things like that. It's not a standard SD card. It's the tiny, tiny card that they're in cell phones, or used to be in cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really astounding, that technology that can pack. I mean, it would be kind of interesting to see the smallest Bitcoin node you could possibly build in physical size. What is the absolute smallest Bitcoin node you can build?
You mean it's in physical size?
In physical size, just for a weird thought experiment. Maybe it's a silly thought experiment, but when we just think about how little power is needed to run a Bitcoin node,
mm-hmm.
it's also quite remarkable, because I know that you run a node, I run a node. We both run it on Raspberry Pis,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where we're not running it on a real computer. I
Right.
used to run on a real computer, but I think the Raspberry Pi does a great job.
Yeah.
Although I know the Raspberry Pi is a real computer, but I
Well,
think that,
it's all relative, right? I mean,
right. But I'm saying we basically bought a little put it together kit, right, of parts, with a very, very low power, inexpensive computer.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have a high power chip in it. I mean, compared to the computers of 20 years ago, it's certainly viable. But
my first computer had 20K of RAM. This one has 8 gigs. So
exactly. So there's it's my point here is that it requires, to run an Ethereum node, who knows what you need? I don't think we really know. I think it's very expensive.
No.
I know
To run
Jameson. Yeah.
Yeah, to run a full archival node of Ethereum, I believe, is almost impossible unless you're doing it with
Like the data
commercial
center.
grade. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so when we compare that to Bitcoin, and even if we think about what might happen here with Bitcoin and these ordinals, is that it requires sort of a minimally functional computer and a minimal amount of storage space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty amazing. And that's what's being used to verify the network, are these really easy, cheap, low power computers.
Right. They don't have to do much. I mean, The hardest lift they'll ever do is just downloading the blockchain for the first time, and
by a factor of 100, right?
yeah, and
You know,
other than
that's
that,
before.
it just runs, and
Right, right.
um, all right, what else you got?
I think that's good for me. I personally got a lot out of that when it came to the ordinals, and we saw the Fireside Chat on Monday night,
Yeah.
and I hadn't spent that much time really thinking it over. I know you and I have not really chatted about it, and I thought that was helpful too.
Yeah.
So I'm good.
All right. Well, I guess I will let everybody know where they could find us.
Thank you.
Um, our website is btcbutlers.com. We're at BTC Butlers on Twitter. You can email us info@btcbutlers.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, subscribe, tell your friends, send us emails or questions. We'd love to talk about any topics of interest. And then Bitcoin Butlers can help you implement best practices as a Bitcoin owner. We subscribe to the 5 best practices of buying, storing, inheritance planning, running your own node, and keeping everything up to date, and are happy to help you do any of those things. Please reach out.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. Till next time. Bye.